The town of Garnet Falls, Colorado Territory did not forgive weakness. It did not announce this. It did not need to. You learned it the way you learned everything in a place like that, through the way people looked at you when you were struggling and the particular quality of the silence that followed. Clara Maughan had been learning it for 2 years. She was 27 years old, which in Garnet Falls meant she was old enough to know better and young enough that people still felt entitled to tell her so. She was not a large woman, but she carried herself like one, shoulders squared, chin-level eyes that moved over a room the way a person moves over ground they have already decided to cross. She had brown hair she kept pinned back without ceremony, and hands that had stopped being soft sometime in the winter of 1878, when the washing became the only thing standing between 3 children and the cold. The lean-to off the kitchen was where she worked. It had a tin tub and a washboard and a stove that required coaxing every morning to give up heat. And in that lean-to from before first light until the light gave out, Clara Maughan scrubbed other people's linen. She scrubbed the shirts of the men who ran the assay office and the aprons of the women who ran the boarding house and the Sunday tablecloths of families who had enough tablecloths to spare one for washing. She scrubbed until her knuckles split and bled, and then she wrapped them in strips of old flour sack and scrubbed some more because there was no alternative that she could see, and Clara Maughan had never been a woman who spent much time on alternatives she could not see. The respectable women of Garnet Falls had their opinion about all of this. They held it the way they held most opinions, with both hands in public and with the particular satisfaction of people who believe their judgment is a form of generosity. A girl her age, they said. No husband, no prospects, no family of her own to speak of. Throwing her one chance away on another woman's children. It was a kind of foolishness the sort of person brought entirely on herself. They said it with their mouths turned down in sympathy, which was the local custom for saying a hard thing while appearing to regret the saying of it. Clara heard all of it. She kept her chin where it was and went on scrubbing. The children were not in the technical sense hers. Her sister Ida had died in the winter of 1878, in the 3rd week of January, when the cold came down off the Rockies with a particular fury and did not lift for 6 weeks. Ida had been sick since October, the lung fever, the kind that starts as a cough and ends as something you cannot come back from, and by the time the ground thawed enough to dig a proper grave, Clara had already been sleeping in the house on Birch Street for 3 months, managing the children and the fire and the slow, terrible arithmetic of watching someone leave. Ida's husband, Curtis Vane, had not been there for any of it. He had gone west or so, he said before he went to find work to get ahead of a debt, to look at something he had heard about in Nevada. He had said it the way men say things when they have already decided and are only performing the explanation for the benefit of the person they are leaving. That had been more than a year before Ida got sick. There had been no letters. There had been no money. There had been, as far as Clara could determine, no Curtis Vane at all, only the absence of him, which was its own kind of presence in a house with 3 children who had learned not to ask. Clement was 10 years old and had appointed himself the man of the house with the gravity of a boy, who understood the weight of the title and intended to carry it whether it fit him or not. He was a serious child with a serious face, and he moved through the world with the watchfulness of someone who had been surprised once by loss and did not intend to be surprised again. He did the small repairs he could manage. He carried water without being asked. He kept his opinions about things to himself and expressed them only in the particular quality of his silences, which Clara had learned to read the way you learn to read, whether not by what it said, but by what it withheld. Willa was 7. And where Clement was closed, she was open not carelessly, but with the deliberate trust of a child who has decided that the world is worth engaging with, despite evidence to the contrary. She had Ida's eyes, which was a thing Clara had to absorb in small doses, and a habit of standing very still and watching people with an attention that made adults uncomfortable and children curious. She had not spoken of her mother since February. Clara did not push. There are griefs that have their own timeline, and a woman who understood that particular truth did not rush it in a 7-year-old. Dory was 3. She did not remember a mother. She had not yet decided what to call Clara, had not in fact decided to call anyone, anything in particular, which the doctor in town said was within the range of normal for a child her age, and which Clara suspected had less to do with development and more to do with a 3-year-old's canny assessment of the situation. Dory communicated primarily through the lifting of her arms, which she extended toward whatever she wanted with a directness that Clara found both exhausting and, in her private moments, quietly moving. You always knew where you stood with Dory. There was something to be said for that. So that was the house on Birch Street in the autumn of 1879. 3 children, a tin tub, a stove that required negotiation, and Clara Maughan, who had not asked for any of it and would not have traded it for anything she could name. She did not say this to the women of Garnet Falls who would not have understood it. She did not say it to anyone. It was simply a fact she carried the way she carried most things quietly, without making a production of it in the belief that a thing spoken too often loses its truth. The rule she had made for herself was this: she would not ask. She had made it after her father died. Emmett Maughan, who had worked a small piece of ground outside of town until the spring of 1878, took him quietly in the way that slow illnesses take quiet men, and she had made it again after Ida, and she held it the way you hold a thing you know is keeping you upright. She would not ask her neighbors for help with the children. She would not ask the church for the basket they left for widows at Christmas. She would not ask the county for anything because the county's help came in the shape of a building on the edge of town with iron bars on the lower windows, and Clara had looked at that building and made her decision. She would earn what she needed, and she would keep what she had, and she would not be beholden to anyone for the privilege of doing so. That was the principle she lived by. It worked, the way hard things work, not smoothly, not without cost, but adequately, which was what adequately meant enough to continue. And then on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1879, she opened the front door to shake out the breakfast cloth and found 4 brown eggs on the step. They were sitting in the hollow where the second board had warped away from the first, wrapped in a piece of clean white rag tied with a length of kitchen twine. Not dropped, not left carelessly. Set down with a deliberateness that was visible in the arrangement of them, the cloth folded under and around the knot, small and even. Someone had taken time with this. Clara stood in the doorway in the grey morning cold and looked at them for a long while before she let herself believe they were meant to stay. She brought them inside. She asked Clement as casually as she could manage whether he had taken them from somewhere a neighbor's yard, a pen he might have passed on the way home from school. Clement looked at her with the precise expression of a boy who has been accused of a thing he considers beneath him and said that he had not. The clarity of his offense convinced her. Clement was many things, but he was not a liar, and he was too proud of that particular truth to begin now. She knocked at the 2 nearest houses on Birch Street. She asked carefully whether anyone had left something by mistake and received blank looks from both doorways, the particular blank look of people who are telling the truth without knowing why they are being asked. The eggs were simply there. And there were 3 hungry children and a breakfast to be made, so she cooked them. Thursday morning, 4 more eggs, same cloth, same hollow of the step. The Tuesday after that, 4 eggs again. By the middle of October it was most mornings, and sometimes there was more than eggs. A paper twist with a handful of dried apples inside. A small sack of cornmeal tied at the neck with the same twine. And then one morning in the 3rd week of October, a length of dark wool folded on the step, not a scrap, not a remnant, but a deliberate piece cut clean on all 4 sides. Clara picked it up and held it against the light coming through the kitchen window and understood with a cold precision exactly how much wool it was enough to make over into a coat for a boy of 10 with material left for the hem to let down as he grew. She stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. Whoever was doing this knew the house. Knew there were children in it, knew their ages or close enough to ages to know the difference between a boy of 10 and a girl of 7. Knew that a child of 10 in Colorado territory in October needed a coat. Clara began sleeping light. She lay in the dark and listened for footsteps on the porch, for the particular sound of the gate latch, for anything that would give her a shape to attach to what she could not account for. She examined the situation the way she examined everything methodically without sentiment, and what she found frightened her. Because charity in Garnet Falls came with a ledger and a sermon attached to it always, and this came with neither. And a thing given freely and in secret was a thing she did not know how to hold. She could not calculate the size of a debt she could not see the terms of. Unknown debts were the worst kind, because you could not prepare for them. She decided she would catch whoever it was and make them stop. Or make them explain. One of the two. She had been trying since the first week of October, when it became clear the gifts were not stopping on their own. She had taken to rising earlier, standing at the kitchen window in the dark, watching. 3 weeks of early mornings had produced nothing but cold feet and the growing suspicion that whoever was leaving the eggs knew the rhythm of the house well enough to arrive and depart in the narrow window between her first sleep and her second waking. She finally caught him in the first week of November, and it was nearly by accident. She had been awake since 2 in the morning with Dory, who was cutting a back tooth, and had opinions about it that she was expressing continuously at considerable volume. Clara had walked the kitchen floor until Dory's protests gave way to the exhausted quiet of a child who has argued herself to sleep. And then she stood at the cold window rather than risk the creaking hallway floor on the way back to the bedroom. She was standing like that, Dory's weight solid and finally still against her shoulder. The kitchen dark around her, the pre-dawn quiet outside complete when she saw the shape come through the gate. A man. Large through the shoulders, moving with the particular quiet of someone who has practiced not making noise, not sneaking, but deliberate the way a man moves when he is trying not to disturb a sleeping house. He had a basket in one hand. He did not come to the door. He came to the step crouched down with the careful economy of a man who has learned to do things gently, regardless of his size, and set something in the hollow of the second board with a care that did not match the breadth of his shoulders. Then he straightened, turned to go. Clara opened the door. The cold came in all at once. The man stopped at the gate with his back half to her, caught in the particular stillness of a person who has been found out and has not yet decided what to do about it. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he turned around. She knew him the way you know everyone in a town the size of Garnet Falls, by sight, by association, by the accumulation of passing observations that add up to a kind of knowledge without ever quite becoming acquaintance. Silas Holt. He farmed grain on a place a mile east of town, his land beginning where the last house on the east road ended and running down to the creek where the ground leveled and the soil was good. He kept chickens. He had buried a wife 6 years ago, and the town had largely stopped speaking of her because Silas Holt gave them nothing to work with on the subject, and a story with no fuel eventually goes out. He was 35 years old, with a face that weather and work had made plain, and even not hard exactly, but shaped by use into something that did what it needed to do without comment. He came to church on Sunday mornings and left before the talking started. He bought what he needed at the feed store and the dry goods and exchanged what words were required for commerce and no more. He was not unfriendly. He was simply a man who had found a sustainable distance from the world and saw no reason to reduce it. He stood at the gate in the pre-dawn dark with his hat in his hand, looking at her. "It's you," Clara said. "It is." His voice was rough from the early hour and from disuse. He looked at the basket in his hand, as if he had briefly forgotten it was there. "I'll stop if you want me to stop." A pause. "I never meant for you to have to thank me. That's why I came early." "Why?" Clara said. It was not entirely a question. It was the distillation of 6 weeks of watching and calculating. Why would a man leave eggs on a woman's step for 6 weeks without once knocking on the door or asking for a thing in return? Silas Holt looked at her standing in the doorway with a sick baby on her hip and the cold coming in around her and the faint sound of 2 more children breathing in sleep somewhere behind her in the house. He was a long time answering. When he answered, he did not dress it up. "Because I watched you carry them all summer," he said, "and I watched you go without, so they wouldn't." He set the basket on top of the gatepost. A man sees a thing like that, he can do something about it, or he can decide it's not his business. A brief pause. "I decided it was my business. I'll keep on if you'll let me, and I'll knock from now on if that suits you better. But I'd assume you didn't thank me." It wasn't done to be thanked. He put his hat back on and walked away down the road without looking back. Clara stood in the open door until the cold persuaded her inside. She stood in the kitchen with the baby still asleep on her shoulder and looked at the basket on the gatepost through the window and felt the careful way she had organized her life come up against a situation it did not have a category for. She did not sleep again that morning. The next time she saw Silas Holt was 4 days later at the grain merchant's on Front Street. She had the coins in her coat pocket, not enough to cover everything, but enough to establish the terms of the thing as a transaction rather than a gift. A transaction had a ledger, and a ledger had a bottom line, and a bottom line was something she knew how to read. She said what she had prepared. She held out the coins. He looked at them. Then he looked at her. "I didn't come for that," he said. And he went back to his business with the grain merchant, and the conversation was over. It cost her something to put the coins back into her pocket. It cost her more than she showed. She had spent her whole life refusing help on principle because help in her experience was a thing that arrived with a hook set inside it, visible only later when the hook had already caught. And a man who refused payment for his help was either a better man than she had any reason to trust, or he was concealing a hook she had not yet found. She did not know which. That was the problem. She bought a sheet of paper at the dry goods that afternoon and wrote on it in her clearest hand, "No more. Thank you." She folded it and tucked it into the gate latch on her way in that evening where it could not be missed. The next morning she woke before dawn and went to the kitchen window. The note was gone. In the hollow of the second board on the step, wrapped in the same clean white rag, were 4 brown eggs. She stood at the window for a long time. She was angry. She understood this clearly, and she examined it with the same methodical attention she gave to everything. She was angry because she could not make this stop, and she had never before encountered a kindness she could not refuse. Every kindness she had ever been offered had a shape she could identify, which meant she could find the edges of it and determine where the obligation began. This one had no shape she could find. The inability to find it made her feel for the first time in 2 years that she was not entirely in control of her own ground. She cooked the eggs. She fed the children. She went to the lean-to and scrubbed until the feeling passed. Then she went to the window and looked at the gate and made a decision. If Silas Holt was going to keep coming, she would rather know what she was dealing with. She told him the next time he appeared at the gate that he could knock from now on and come in for coffee if he intended to come at all, because she was not going to conduct this arrangement through a gatepost for the rest of the winter. It was not an invitation. It was a renegotiation of terms. He seemed to understand the difference. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee she poured and said very little, which suited her. She was not interested in conversation for the sake of filling silence. He came back the next morning and the one after that, and Clara watched him figure out the children. He did not try to be liked. This was the first thing she noticed, because it was the thing she would have expected a man trying to make himself agreeable to a woman's household, performing warmth, angling toward approval. He did none of that. He came in, he sat down, he drank his coffee, and he let the children decide what to do with him. He brought a broken bridle one morning and set it on the table in front of Clement with the explanation that he hadn't the patience for fine leather work, and had heard the boy had steady hands. This was a lie of the kindest possible variety. A man who farmed 80 acres alone for 6 years had patience for everything, and Clement knew it was a lie, and worked the bridle anyway, and something between them eased a notch that neither would have named. Willa began appearing at the edge of the kitchen when Silas was there. First in the doorway, then at the far end of the table, ostensibly occupied with something else watching him from the corner of her eye, with the particular attention of a child who has decided to make a study of someone. He did not make a production of noticing. He simply included her in the room when he spoke the way you include furniture you have decided is comfortable. Dory reached for him on the 3rd morning, her arms going up in her customary manner, requesting without asking. Silas picked her up with the ease of a man for whom this was not a new thing, settling her against his arm in a way that suggested it was entirely natural. Dory grabbed his collar, looked at him with frank assessment, apparently found him satisfactory, and subsided. Clara watched all of this from the other side of the kitchen and said nothing. What she was thinking was that he was not trying to win her. He was learning them. There was a difference, and she had spent enough time among people who wanted things from her to recognize it. She did not know what to do with a man who made that particular distinction without being told to make it. On a cold afternoon in early November, Mrs. Adelaide Harlan came to call. Mrs. Harlan was not a cruel woman. Clara had considered this carefully over the years and arrived at it as an honest conclusion. She was not cruel. She was something more common and in some ways more difficult, a woman who had decided that her opinions constituted a form of care and who therefore dispensed them with the confidence of someone doing a kindness. She sat in Clara's front room and drank Clara's coffee and got to the point by a route that visited several preparatory landscapes first. It was about appearances, she said, about how a thing looked and what was being said. A man coming to a house before light, a woman living alone unmarried with children that were not even her own. People talked. It wasn't Mrs. Harlan's place to say so, of course, but someone ought to, for Clara's own good. A woman's name was the only thing she truly owned in a town like this, and Clara was spending hers carelessly, on a strange man's charity and another woman's babies. Wouldn't she be wiser, Mrs. Harlan said, to give the children over to the county and start fresh while she was young enough? Clara let her finish. She had learned long ago that this kind of speech cannot be stopped in the middle. You can only hold still and let it run out, the way a creek runs out after a hard rain. When Mrs. Harlan had finished, Clara stood and opened the door for her and said the only thing she had to say about it. "Those are my sister's children, Mrs. Harlan. They are mine now. There is no fresh start on this earth worth handing them to strangers for. Thank you for the visit." Mrs. Harlan left with the stiffness of a woman whose generosity has been declined. Clara closed the door and stood with her back against it for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house willa moving in the other room, the stove working the particular quality of a place that held living people in it. Then she went back to the washing. That same evening, after the children were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp low and opened a letter that had arrived that afternoon from a lawyer's office in Denver. It had been forwarded through the postal route that served the mountain passes, which meant it had been traveling since early September and had only just arrived. It was informational in tone, careful in language, and it concerned the estate of Emmett Maughan, her father, who had died in the spring of 1878. The trust he had established before his death, a small piece of ground east of Garnet Falls, and a modest sum of money had been formally administered and recorded. The trust was held for the benefit of the children of Ida Vanne née Maughan. This was not entirely news. She had known about the trust in general terms. What was new was the paragraph near the bottom of the letter, written with the precision of a man who understood that this particular information required care. The lawyer wished to advise her that in cases of contested guardianship in Colorado territory, the courts generally gave weight to the claims of biological parents where such parents could be located and could demonstrate an intention to resume their parental obligations. The trust being held for the benefit of the children would in such a case follow the children. He wrote this so that she would be fully informed of the legal landscape. The lawyer had also noted with the careful neutrality of a man who understood the implications that matters of this nature, trusts minor children, absent fathers, had a way of traveling through the networks of men who made it their business to know such things. She understood what he meant without requiring him to say it plainly. Clara read the letter 4 times. Then she took out a paper and began to write. She wrote to the lawyer in Denver asking specific questions about the legal process for establishing formal guardianship and what documentation the territorial court would require. She wrote to the county clerk's office requesting information about the formal procedures for recording such a claim. And she began making a list. 2 years of care. Every expense, every date, every doctor's visit, every pair of shoes outgrown and replaced. The names of neighbors who had witnessed her management of the household. The name of Miss Alderton at the schoolhouse, who could speak to Clement's attendance. The name of Reverend Pruitt, who had presided over Ida's burial and had seen that no other family member had appeared. The name of Dr. Fenwick, who had treated the children through their illnesses. She did not know yet where Curtis Vane was. She did not know if he was coming, but she had read enough of the world to know that a man who had been gone this long and left no word was not gone for good reasons. And a man without good reasons sometimes found, when money entered the picture, a reason to come back. She would be ready. This was her family, her fight. Whatever was coming, she would meet it by herself. She did not tell Silas Holt the next morning when he came for coffee. She sat across the table from a man who had been leaving eggs on her step because he had seen her go without, and she did not say a word about the letter, because this was not his problem to carry. But when he stood to leave and paused at the door with his hat in his hand, and said in his plain way that the coffee was good, she found herself saying, before she had exactly decided to say it, that he could come back tomorrow if he wanted. He put his hat on. "All right," he said. He went out. The gate swung closed behind him, quiet the way Clement had taken to leaving it. Outside, the first serious snow of the season was beginning to fall. It came down soft and unhurried, the way the serious snow always started in Colorado, not announcing itself, not making a display, just beginning with the patience of something that intended to stay. What Clara did not know, what no one in Garnet Falls knew, because Silas Holt told his business to no one, was what he was doing in the evenings after the lamp on Birch Street went dark. He was building. On the flat ground east of his property, where the land ran level to the creek and the soil was the good dark kind that held moisture through the dry months he had been clearing and grubbing since September. He had pulled stumps and leveled ground, and dug a foundation and begun setting walls, working in the short cold days and the long dark evenings by lantern light, moving with the deliberate efficiency of a man who has calculated exactly what he can accomplish in the hours available and intends to accomplish it without waste. It was a house, not large but sound, 4 rooms, a proper kitchen with a south-facing window, a bedroom on the east side where the morning light would come in early, 2 smaller rooms on the north that faced the mountains. He had framed the windows at a height that let in light without losing heat. He had fitted the floor from planks he had milled himself from timber on the back of his property, using wood. He had been drying since the previous winter because green wood warped, and a warped floor was a floor that told on itself in every season. Beyond the house, the frame of a hen house, properly ventilated, built to hold 30 birds. A garden plot turned under and waiting 50 feet by 30 in the rich soil by the creek. The beginning of a fence line running east along the creek bank. The housing for a well already dug to 17 feet and hitting good water. He had not decided yet how he would say what it was for. He was, as he was aware, better at building than at saying. He had known this about himself for a long time and had made his peace with it. So he built, and he left the saying for later. And meanwhile he left eggs on a step on Birch Street before dawn. Old Ruford Cray, who farmed the adjacent quarter section and possessed a curiosity he had long since stopped pretending he did not have, came by one afternoon in late November and stood at the edge of the building site with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at what was taking shape. "Whose is it?" Ruford asked. Silas kept setting the window frame. "Not decided yet." Ruford looked at the 4 rooms. Looked at the 2 smaller rooms on the north side, looked at the crib Silas had been fitting together in the corner of the main room, a small piece of furniture, built with the particular care of something intended for a very small occupant. Ruford nodded slowly. He put his hat back on and walked back toward his own fence line without asking another word. The snow that had started in late October settled over Garnet Falls and stayed. By the time the first week of November was done, the streets had gone to packed white, and the creek east of town had slowed and darkened, and the mountains that ring the valley had pulled cloud over themselves like a man pulling a coat collar up against the wind. The world contracted. The distances between places became negotiable in a way they had not been in the warm months, not smaller, but weighted differently, so that a mile felt like a question you had to answer before you set out. Clara shoveled the front step each morning before the children woke. She shoveled it with the same attention she gave to everything, thoroughly beginning at the door and working outward, because there was no point clearing ground halfway. Then she started the stove, put water on, and stood at the kitchen window in the gray pre-dawn light. She had shoveled the step and started the stove and stood at the window the way she stood at windows in the early dark, not waiting for anything in particular. only keeping watch the way a person does when they have learned that the morning sometimes brings things that require immediate attention. Silas came most mornings now. He knocked the way he had promised. He came in and sat at the table and drank what she poured and let the sounds of the house settle around him. Clement getting ready for school. Willa appearing and disappearing with her characteristic quiet. Dory making her views on breakfast known. He did not perform comfort. He simply occupied the space without apology, the way a large thing occupies a space when it has decided the space suits it. One morning in early November, he arrived with a length of wood balanced on his shoulder and without particular announcement went to work on the lean-to door that had hung crooked since before Ida died. Clara came out to the porch to say she had not asked for that, and he looked at her over the door's edge with an expression that suggested he was aware of this and had no strong feelings about it either way, and she went back inside because there was nothing useful she could add. He had the door hanging true inside of an hour. She did not thank him. He did not wait for thanks. Another morning he brought a pot of pine pitch and patched the gap along the base of the window Dory had cracked the previous winter, working with the patient care of a man accustomed to doing fine things with large hands. Clara watched him from the kitchen and thought about a person who gives time rather than money, because time was the thing she had least of and she understood its value in a way she could not entirely articulate. Clement watched too from angles he assumed were not obvious. Clara saw the watching and said nothing. A 10-year-old boy decides who he trusts through a process that has nothing to do with logic and everything to do with accumulated observation, and the only useful thing you can do is stay out of the way of it. It was resolving. She could see it in the small adjustments, the way Clement had stopped leaving the table when Silas sat down, the way he had begun directing occasional remarks toward that end of the room. Brief remarks about nothing in particular, the way boys open doors a crack and wait to see what comes through. Silas received these remarks with the grave attentiveness of a man who understood what they cost and responded in kind briefly, without expansion, leaving room for the boy to decide how far he wanted to go. One afternoon in the second week of November, Clara came into the kitchen to find them sitting at the table together with the broken bridle between them, not speaking, each working on a separate section of the leather, with the companionable quiet of two people who have discovered they do not need to fill the air between them. Willa was in the doorway with her arms folded and her head tilted, watching them with an expression Clara recognized the face her sister used to make when she was trying to decide whether something was safe to want. Clara went back to the lean-to and stood over the wash-tub for a while without scrubbing anything. She was not a woman given to sentiment. She had worked it out of herself through 2 years of practical necessity, the way you work water out of wet wool, by application of steady pressure until what remains holds its shape without assistance. Sentiment made you soft in places you needed to be solid, and a woman who was soft in the wrong places in a Colorado winter with 3 children and a tin tub did not survive the season intact. But there were moments, and this was one of them, when what she had built came up against something it did not have a category for. When the numbers added up to something they did not have a name for. She scrubbed shirts until the feeling passed. Then she went back inside and started supper. It was the second week of November when the reply came from the Denver lawyer faster than she had expected, which told her he considered this a matter worth answering promptly. She read it standing at the kitchen table alone while the children were at school and the house was quiet. He confirmed that under territorial law in Colorado, a biological father retained legal standing to petition for custody of his children regardless of the length of his absence, provided he could demonstrate intent to resume his parental obligations. He confirmed that the trust established by Emmett Maughan would in such a case be administered by the court consistent with the custodial arrangement. He noted that Clara's position as the children's guardian for the past 2 years would be given weight by the court, but that weight and legal standing were not the same thing. He enclosed a petition for formal guardianship, which if filed with the territorial court in Denver and granted would establish her legal authority on a firmer basis than informal care. It required documentation. It required witnesses. It required at minimum a sworn statement from a justice of the peace or judge in her district, confirming the circumstances of her guardianship. He advised her to file promptly. Clara folded the letter and put it in the drawer beneath the kitchen counter behind the flour sack and the tin of matches. Then she sat at the table and thought. She would not tell Silas. This was not a decision she made with any drama. It was simply the application of the principles she had always lived by. This was her family, her problem. Whatever legal storm was forming on her horizon, she would prepare for it the way she prepared for all storms alone, methodically, without announcing the weather to anyone who might feel obligated to stand in the rain beside her. She took out paper and began her list in earnest. Every date she could document, every expense. The name of Dr. Fenwick, who had treated Dory's ear infection in February, and Willa's fever in April, and Clement's broken finger in June. Miss Alderton, who could speak to Clement's enrollment. Reverend Pruitt, who had buried Ida and noted for the record that no husband had appeared. Ruford Cray, the old farmer, half a mile east, who had seen Clara in the yard with the children through every season since January of 1878. She would build the case on what she had and give the court no gaps to work with. She worked at the kitchen table until she heard the children coming up the road, and then she put the papers away and started supper and said nothing. 3 mornings later, Clement came home from school with something tucked inside his coat. He set it on the table without comment. A folded newspaper yellowed at the edges. The kind of paper that has been handled many times and stored in several places. He set it down and stepped back and watched her the way he watched things when he had decided the watching was more important than the saying. Clara unfolded it. It was a copy of the Kansas City Courier dated 14 months earlier. The paper was open to page 3, where a short article had been marked with a faint pencil line along the margin. The article concerned an incident at a gambling establishment on Commerce Street. A man named Curtis Vane had been removed from the premises following a dispute over a hand of cards in which other players had alleged irregularities. The establishment's owner had declined to press charges but had stated for the record that the man was barred from the premises and was known to other proprietors in the district. There was a description. It matched. Clara read the article twice, then she looked at Clement. "Where did you find this Hargrove's barn?" he said. "He uses old papers for the stall floors. I was helping him stack wood last Saturday." A pause. I recognized the name. She looked at her nephew. This boy who had appointed himself the man of the house and worn the title without complaint, who had gone into an old man's barn on a Saturday and found a newspaper and carried it home inside his coat because he understood without being told that it was information that belonged to his aunt. She had been holding herself together for 2 years with the steady application of will and the refusal to show the children anything they could not afford to see. She had cried exactly once since Ida died alone at the wash tub with the water running so no one would hear, and had considered that sufficient. She sat down at the table. And then for the second time in 2 years, Clara Maughan cried. Not loudly, not with any drama. Just the quiet dissolution of something that had been held rigid for too long, the way ice gives way in March, not all at once, but in the place where the pressure has been greatest. Clement sat down beside her. He did not say anything. He did not offer comfort in any of the ways children are sometimes taught to offer it. He simply sat with the patient solidity of a person who has decided that presence is enough. After a while, Clara straightened. She folded the newspaper and put it with the other papers in the drawer. "Thank you," she said. Clement nodded. He got up and went to do his chores, and the subject was closed, and between them something shifted that had not been where it needed to be before. She added the newspaper to her documentation. It was in those weeks, the weeks of lists and letters and the slow, careful construction of a legal case. She told no one she was building that she also, without intending to, began to understand something about Silas Holt that she had been avoiding. He was not performing kindness. That was the thing she finally put words to, watching him from the kitchen window one morning as he came up the road in the early dark with frost on his coat collar. He was not managing an obligation or building toward something he intended to collect. He was simply doing what he believed needed doing in the way a person does a thing they have decided is right and therefore requires no further justification. She had encountered very few people in her life who operated that way. Her father had been one. Ida, in her better seasons, had been another. It was not a common thing. She was paying attention to it. One evening in late November, when the children were in bed and Silas had stayed later than usual to help Clement finish a piece of harness work by lamplight, she poured a second cup of coffee and set it in front of him. And then, without particularly planning to say it, she said, "What was she like?" He knew what she was asking. He was quiet for a long time, looking at the coffee cup. "Good," he said finally. "She was genuinely good." He paused. "The kind of good that doesn't come from effort. That just is." He did not say anything for a while. Then, "She deserved more years than she got." Clara nodded. She did not press. The information was sufficient not because it answered her questions, but because it told her what she needed to know about the shape of the loss, and therefore about the shape of the man. A person who has loved something genuinely and lost it without bitterness is a particular kind of person. Not common. She filed this understanding away in the careful interior accounting she kept of what she knew and what she did not yet know, and she drank her coffee and let the fire fill the silence, and it was the easiest evening she could remember in a long time. Meanwhile, on the flat ground east of his property, Silas was making progress. The walls of the house were up and the roof was unsealed against the snow that had been falling steadily since October. The interior was rough. Still, the walls not yet plastered the floor, not yet sanded smooth, but the bones of it were there, and they were true. The henhouse stood complete, its ventilation fitted correctly for the altitude and the winter winds that came down off the mountains from the northwest. The garden plot was turned under and frozen now, waiting for spring under 2 feet of snow. The crib in the corner of the main room was finished. He had not told anyone this. He had told no one any of it. He was building in the evenings after the Birch Street lamp went dark and in the short daylight hours when his own farm chores were done, and he was building alone because a man building something like this needs to do it without audience, and he was running slightly ahead of what he had expected to finish by Christmas, which was satisfying in the quiet way that satisfying things are satisfying to a man who does not require an audience for his satisfactions. Ruford Cray came by again in the first week of December, looked at the finished roof, and the standing walls and the curl of smoke from the small stove Silas had set inside to keep the new construction from taking on frost damage. He looked at Silas for a moment. "You're going to have to say it eventually," Ruford said. "I know it," Silas said. Ruford went home. It was in the first week of December that the letter appeared in the box at the end of the Birch Street gate. Not a proper letter. No envelope, no postage mark. No return address. A folded piece of brown paper tucked into the box without ceremony. Clara found it on a Tuesday morning when she went to unlatch the gate before the children left for school. The handwriting was not elegant. It was the handwriting of a person who had learned to write from necessity rather than instruction. 5 words, "Curtis Vane is coming." Careful, no signature. Clara stood at the gate and read it twice. Then she folded it into her apron pocket and called the children to get moving, or they'd be late for Miss Alderton, and they moved, and the morning proceeded. She did not tell Silas when he came an hour later. She poured his coffee and sat across the table from him and felt the paper in her apron pocket with a clarity that was almost physical, like a stone she was carrying, without letting it show in her posture. She did not tell him because she had already decided not to, and the decision had not required deliberation. She had made it the moment she read the words. This was her family. These were her children. Whatever was coming up the road toward Garnet Falls, she was the one who would meet it, and she would meet it prepared, and she would not pull a man who had been leaving eggs on her step into something that was hers to face. After Silas left that morning, she sat at the table and calculated. 3 weeks until Christmas, roughly. Enough time if she moved without delay. She wrote to the Denver lawyer that afternoon asking specifically about the petition for formal guardianship and what documentation would be required for a preliminary injunction against a custody claim. She used his language rather than her own because she had learned that legal correspondence responds better to its own vocabulary. She wrote to Judge Harrick at the county courthouse in the next town, enclosing her full documentation, the binder of dates and expenses and witness names, the letters from the Denver lawyer, the newspaper from Kansas City that Clement had found in Ruford's barn. She wrote a clear and unflinching account of the household she had maintained for 2 years, the children she had clothed and fed and schooled, the absence of any other family member who had stepped forward. She asked for his written confirmation of her guardianship status, formally recorded. She sent both letters on a Wednesday and began to wait. She also spent the evenings of that week and the next in a different kind of preparation. The preparation of what she would say if Curtis Vane arrived before the paperwork did. She rehearsed it the way she rehearsed everything that mattered, quietly internally in the early mornings, before the children woke, running through the shape of the conversation until she knew exactly where her ground was and how to stand on it, without the ground appearing to shift beneath her. She would not be caught without an answer. That was the one thing she could guarantee. What she had not anticipated, what entered the picture and could not be accounted for in any of her preparations, was the night of the 14th of December. Dory woke at midnight with a croupy bark that Clara recognized immediately. The sound a small child's chest makes when it is fighting for air. The sound that moved your feet before your mind had finished processing what it was hearing. Clara was in the children's room in seconds, lifting Dory from the bed. The baby's small chest working hard against her shoulder, the bark coming in waves. She had handled sick children before. She was not a woman who panicked. But the croup in a child Dory's age in the middle of a December night in Colorado was not a thing she could manage alone, without difficulty. She needed steam. She needed someone to hold the child upright while she worked the stove, and she recognized this with a clarity that surprised her. She needed the particular quality of calm that she had watched Silas Holt bring to everything he did. Clement appeared at the doorway behind her, already dressed, already understanding. She looked at him over Dory's head. "Go," she said. He went. He put on his coat and his boots and took the lantern from the hallway hook and went out into the December night. 1 mile east on a road that was packed snow and ice, moving at a dead run because he was 10 years old and had decided where he was going before his aunt had finished saying the word. He did not go for the doctor whose house was 2 blocks away. He went for Silas Holt. Clara did not have time to think about what that meant. She was running steam from the kettle, hanging blankets in the doorway, doing what could be done. Willa appeared and sat in the corner of the room in her nightgown with her knees pulled up, watching with the wide, careful eyes of a child who is frightened and working very hard not to show it. "She'll be all right," Clara said. She said it with the certainty of someone who has decided it will be true. Silas arrived in 20 minutes. Which meant Clement had run the whole mile without stopping. He came through the door with his coat half-buttoned and his focus entirely on the immediate problem. He assessed the situation in the kitchen doorway, in Clara's arms, the steam, the labored breathing, and without a word, he took the baby from her. He held Dory against his shoulder upright and began to walk the kitchen floor. Slowly, steadily, a circuit of the kitchen and the hallway and back again, his large hand flat against the baby's back. He kept his voice very low. A steady, wordless sound that communicated warmth through vibration rather than meaning, the kind of sound that works on small, frightened bodies the way a tuning fork works on glass. Clara kept the steam going. Willa eventually fell asleep in the corner, and Clara moved her to bed without waking her. Clement sat at the kitchen table with his coat still on, and his eyes tracking Silas's circuit of the room until sleep took him sitting upright. Silas kept walking. Somewhere past 3 in the morning, the croup broke. Clara heard the shift in Dory's breathing from the tight, effortful bark to something looser, something that moved freely through the small chest. She came to the kitchen doorway and watched Dory go completely slack against Silas's shoulder. Her fist still curled in the fabric of his collar, her breathing slow and clean and even. Silas kept walking slower now. He did not put Dory down. Clara stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame and watched a man she had refused to thank for 3 months walk her sister's baby through the last of a December night. And she stopped refusing to see the things she had been refusing to see since October. It was not a dramatic recognition. It arrived the way genuine things arrive, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small, true observations, seen clearly and honestly, the way you recognize a landscape you have been moving through for some time, but are only now seeing whole. This man had been making the same statement since September in eggs and bridal leather and pine pitch. And a door hung true, and now in the particular way he held a baby who had asked to be held and was being held without any thought of what it cost. He was saying, "I am here. That is all this is." She understood it now, without qualification, without the searching for hidden terms that had kept her from understanding it before. She understood it the way you understand something you have been circling for months and have finally arrived at the center of. She moved quietly to the stove and put water on for coffee because dawn was not far, and there was no point in sleep now. She worked without looking at Silas, and Silas kept his slow circuit, and the kitchen held the two of them and the sleeping baby, and the particular silence that exists between people who are both aware that something has shifted and are giving it the room it needs. Just before 5 in the morning, Silas stopped at the table. "She's asleep," he said. "I know." He stood there with Dory against his shoulder, not moving. Outside, the first gray was at the edge of the mountains. "I'd like to bring you and the children out to my place," he said. "Christmas morning, if the weather holds. There's something I built. I want you to see it." Clara looked at him across the kitchen in the early dark. "What did you build?" He settled Dory a little higher on his shoulder. "You'd have to come out and see." He said it without evasion, not a tease, not a performance. Just a plain statement from a man who had found that showing was more reliable than saying, and who had learned this about himself and made his peace with it. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove. "All right," she said. Outside, the snow had stopped in the night. The sky above the mountains was the deep pre-dawn blue of a Colorado December morning, clear and cold and very still. The kind of sky that gives no warning and offers no apology. 1 mile east on flat ground by a creek, a house sat in the darkness, smelling of new pine and honest labor. It had 4 rooms and a south-facing window and a crib in the corner, fitted together with the care of something made for a very small person by a man who had not yet had permission to make it, but had made it anyway because the alternative was not making it, and that was not an alternative he was willing to live with. It was waiting with the patience of things built solid enough to stand until they are found. Christmas morning came in cold and clear. The kind of cold that had nothing personal in it. Not the vindictive cold of a storm gathering its forces, not the wet ambivalence of a thaw that cannot make up its mind, but the clean declarative cold of a December morning in Colorado when the sky has decided to be blue and commits to it entirely. The mountains stood out against that blue with every ridgeline exact, every shadow precise, as if the night had taken particular care with the drawing of them before stepping aside. Clara was up before the children. She had been up before the children every morning for 2 years, but this morning she rose earlier than usual in the darkness before the blue arrived and stood at the kitchen window with her coffee. She had been having a conversation with herself since before dawn, going through the shape of what the day might ask, the way she went through everything that mattered, quietly and in advance, so that when the moment came she would not be finding her footing for the first time. The paperwork had come on the 18th of December. Judge Harwick's letter had arrived 6 days after she sent her documentation, which told her he had considered it worth answering without delay. He had written in the measured language of a man accustomed to precision, but the meaning was plain based on the evidence presented 2 years of documented care. The witness statements, the records from Dr. Fenwick and Miss Alderton and Reverend Pruitt. He was prepared to sign a preliminary confirmation of guardianship, recorded with the Territorial Court in Denver, establishing Clara Morn as the legal guardian of the 3 minor children pending any formal challenge. The document was enclosed, signed, sealed. She had read it standing at the kitchen table and then sat down because her legs had made that decision on her behalf. She had held the document for a long time. Then she had put it with the other papers in the drawer, and she had gone on with supper because supper needed making, and a document, however significant, did not make itself into biscuits. She had not told Silas. She had thought about it across several mornings and decided against it because a thing done alone should be reported after it is finished and not while the ink is still drying. The conversation would come. It would come on her terms. She had also not told him about the warning note in the gate box. She had simply prepared and waited and watched the road each morning. Now it was Christmas and the road was empty and the blue sky was precise and cold, and she was ready. The satchel she had packed the night before sat by the front door. Inside it, the full binder of documentation, the letters from the Denver lawyer, the Kansas City newspaper, and Judge Harwick's signed confirmation of guardianship. She had arranged it all by lamplight with the methodical care she gave to everything that mattered. She heard Willa first, the contained, effortful quiet of a 7-year-old who has remembered it is Christmas and is trying to be strategic about it. Then Clement's heavier step in the hallway, deliberate. Then Dory, who had no strategy and announced her wakefulness with the unambiguous directness that governed everything she did. Clara made breakfast. Oats, coffee, the last of the dried apples stewed with a little sugar because it was Christmas. She sat at the table with the children and watched them eat and felt underneath the steady readiness that had been running through her since before dawn, something that was not quite calm but was close enough to function as the same thing. Clement looked at the satchel by the front door. He did not ask about it. He looked at it with the attention of a boy who reads rooms by their objects as much as their people, and then he looked at Clara, and he put something away behind his eyes that she recognized as decision. She met his look and held it for a moment, then she nodded once small. He picked up his fork and went back to his oats. They had finished breakfast, and Clara was clearing the table when she heard the horse. One horse from the direction of town. Not fast, but not slow, the deliberate pace of a man who has calculated his entrance and chosen a speed that suggests confidence. She knew before she went to the window who it was. She had been expecting this sound for 3 weeks. The body recognizes what it has been preparing for. She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth and went to the window. Curtis Vane had not changed in any way that mattered. He was on a hired horse, she could tell by the animal's brand, visible even at this distance, and he wore a coat newer than anything she remembered him owning, and a hat that still held the shape of recent purchase. He had the bearing of a man who had rehearsed this arrival and was performing it with satisfaction. The half-smile she remembered from Ida's description of their early courtship was in place the smile of a man who has decided he is charming and has found through repeated confirmation no reason to revise the opinion. "Stay at the table," Clara said to the children. She said it quietly without urgency, because urgency would frighten Willa and put Clement into a state of readiness that might express itself in ways she could not predict. She picked up the satchel from beside the door. Then she put on her coat, buttoned it to the top, and went outside. Curtis was already at the gate. He had dismounted and was standing with the reins in one hand and his other hand on the gate-post, and when Clara came through the front door, he looked at her with a half-smile in place and said, "Clara, you haven't changed." She walked to the gate and stopped on her side of it. She did not open it. "Curtis," she said, "I've come to see my children." "I know why you've come." He looked at the satchel in her hand. The half-smile remained, but something behind it shifted the quick assessment of a man who has spent time in rooms where the contents of documents can change the shape of a negotiation. She opened the satchel and removed the binder. Not urgently, not with any performance of triumph, the way you remove a tool when you need to use it. "I have 2 years of documentation," she said. "Dates, expenses, medical records, from Dr. Fenwick, school records from Miss Alderton, and witness statements from Reverend Pruitt and 3 neighbors who can testify to the circumstances of this household since January of 1878. She paused. "I have a signed preliminary guardianship confirmation from Judge Harwick at the county courthouse recorded with the territorial court in Denver." Another pause. "I also have a copy of an article from the Kansas City Courier from August of 1878 describing your removal from a gambling establishment on Commerce Street with a description that will match the man standing at this gate." The half-smile had gone effortful. "I have a lawyer," he said. "So do I." She held his gaze and did not look away. And in that moment she was aware of something she had not fully known until she was standing here. She had been more afraid than she had admitted even to herself. Not of Curtis Vane, he had never frightened her personally, but of the law of the gap between what was right and what was legal. Of the possibility that 2 years of honest work might not be enough against a man with a biological claim and enough patience for a courtroom. She had converted that fear as she converted everything into preparation. And she was standing on what she had built, and she was not going to let it look uncertain, even if she could feel the weight of the moment in her feet. She looked at Curtis Vane across the gate she had not opened, and she waited. He recalculated. She could see it happening, the internal machinery of a man accustomed to tables where the odds shifted, and who knew how to read a shift. He had arrived with a plan, and the plan had encountered something he had not accounted for, and he was now rapidly assessing the revised landscape. He still had one card. He knew it, and she knew it. "There's the matter of the trust," he said. His voice had lost its performance quality and gone flat and transactional. "Emmett's money, left for my children. Left in trust for them," Clara said. "Administered by the court, not available to their guardian and not available to their father outside of a formal custodial arrangement reviewed by the court." She looked at him steadily. Judge Harwick was very specific about that. Curtis looked at the satchel. He looked at the house behind her. He looked at the neighbors who had begun in the way of neighbors in small towns when something is happening on a street to find reasons to be near their front windows. He understood the landscape. He was a man who had always been able to read a table, and what he read now was that the odds had shifted further than he had expected. But a courtroom was still a courtroom. And courtrooms took time, and time cost money, and Clara Mon scrubbed other people's linen for a living. "I want the trust," he said, the performance gone entirely now. "All of it. I'll sign whatever paper you need and ride out today, and you'll never see me again. The children stay. You just transfer the trust." Before Clara could answer, she heard the wagon. Silas Holt's wagon coming up the East Road because it was Christmas morning, and he had said he would come, and Silas Holt did what he said he would do. He brought the wagon to a stop at the edge of the road, unhurried, and climbed down and looped the reins over the fence rail. Then he walked to where Clara was standing and stopped beside her, not in front of her, not between her and Curtis, but beside her and slightly back in the position of a person who has arrived to stand with someone rather than to replace them. He looked at Curtis Vane with the flat, even assessment of a man who has taken in a situation completely and arrived at a clear conclusion. "Morning," he said, one word carrying the weight of a man who uses words as tools and deploys them with precision. Curtis looked at the size of him, looked at the breadth of the shoulders, the weathered certainty of the face, the complete absence of anything that could be read as performance or uncertainty. He looked back at Clara. "Friend of yours?" "Yes," Clara said, simply without elaboration, in the tone of someone stating a fact they have recently finished arriving at. Silas put his hands in his coat pockets and said nothing further. His presence was not aggressive or theatrical. It was simply the presence of a large, solid, unhurried man who had decided to be somewhere and was being there without apology, and there was something in the quality of that, the complete absence of bluster, that communicated more than any volume would have. Clara looked at Curtis. "You can file your custody petition," she said. "You have the standing to do it, but everything in this satchel goes to Denver with it, and a territorial judge is going to read every page before he decides where those children are better served. And that process will take months, and in those months I will keep documenting, and every day that passes makes my case stronger and yours thinner." She let that sit for a moment. "Or you can sign a full relinquishment today in front of witnesses and walk away with whatever Silas thinks is fair for your trouble, and the trust every cent of my father's money for those children stays exactly where it belongs." Curtis looked at Silas. Silas reached into his coat and brought out a leather wallet worn at the fold, the kind carried a long time through weather. He opened it and removed a quantity of bills and held them in his hand. He looked at the money for a moment with the expression of a man who has made a decision he is at peace with. "The trust stays where it is," Silas said. "That money belongs to those children, and this conversation has nothing to do with it." He held the bills out. "This is mine, from the fall grain. You'll sign before Reverend Pruitt and whatever neighbors care to witness a full relinquishment, permanent and recorded. And this is what you take for the trouble of signing it. The trust is untouched. You leave Garnet Falls today, and if you come within a county of any of this after today, Clara has enough paper in that satchel to follow you to Denver and file herself." He said it in the way he said most things, without heat, without the performance of anger or righteousness. Just the geometry of the situation laid out in the terms that applied. Curtis looked at the money. He looked at the satchel. He looked at the gate that had not been opened. He looked at the house behind Clara and at the figure that had appeared in the doorway. Clement. The boy stood in the doorway of the house on Birch Street in the coat Clara had made him from the wool that had appeared on the step in October, and he looked at the man at the gate. Not with hatred, not with the trembling fury of a child confronting the source of his abandonment, with something quieter and more complete than any of those things, the expression of a person who has conducted a reckoning privately over a long time and has arrived at a conclusion that requires no further processing. The look of a boy who was done. Curtis Vane had been assessed by lawyers and gamblers and men across card tables in several states, and he had learned to read the faces of people determining his value. What he read in the face of his 10-year-old son standing in a doorway on a Christmas morning in Colorado was something he did not have a specific word for, but understood with complete clarity. The boy had already left him. Quietly a long time ago, and finally, and without any drama at all. Curtis took the money. He did not look at Clement again. He folded the bills into his coat and said he would want Reverend Pruitt before the end of the morning. Silas said that could be arranged, and it was in the way. Things are arranged in a small town on a clear morning, when 3 neighbors are already putting on their coats because they understand that something is happening on Birch Street that they are being asked to witness. Reverend Pruitt came up the road from the parsonage with his document case under his arm. He prepared the relinquishment on the flat top of the fence post, the full and permanent language that Curtis had agreed to, and Curtis read it and signed it with the pen Reverend Pruitt produced. 2 neighbors witnessed it. Reverend Pruitt witnessed it. The document went into Clara's satchel. Curtis Vane mounted the hired horse and rode back toward town without looking back. The sound of hooves on the packed snow road diminished and then was absorbed by the silence of a winter morning that has finished with its business. Clement let out a breath, not a gasp, not a sob, just air released from a place that had been holding it for a long time. He stood in the doorway of the house on Birch Street and let it go, and his shoulders came down half an inch, and he looked 10 years old, which was what he was, and which he had not quite looked for some time. The neighbors went home. Reverend Pruitt shook Clara's hand and Silas's hand and walked back to the parsonage. The road was empty. The blue sky held. The mountains were still precise. Silas stood at the gate with his hat in his hand. He turned it once, and then he stopped turning it, and he looked at Clara. He said what he had to say the way he did everything, without decoration, without build-up, in the language of a man who has spent a long time finding the exact words and has now simply arrived at the delivering of them. There was something at his place, he said, east of the property on the flat ground by the creek. He had been at it since September. He had built it in the early mornings and the short fall afternoons. And the evenings after the lamp on Birch Street went dark, and he had built it alone, because this was the kind of thing a man needed to do without audience. He had built it because he was better at building than at saying, and he had known since the summer what he wanted to say, and had not found the words, and had therefore found the wood instead. It was a house. 4 rooms, a kitchen with a south-facing window, 2 small rooms on the north side facing the mountains, a hen house with space for 30 birds, a garden plot turned under and waiting for spring, a well sunk to good water. He looked at her steadily. It was hers, he said, hers and the children's, regardless of what she decided. He would deed it to her outright today, and she could take it, and that would be the end of it, and he would not call it back, and he would not regret the building of it, because a thing built for the right reason does not require the right outcome to justify the building. But he was asking her to take it with him in it. He said he had loved her since July, since the morning he had watched her cross Front Street with Dory on her hip and a basket of washing in one hand, and her chin exactly level going without, so the children wouldn't, and had understood in the particular way that simple true things are sometimes understood all at once and without room for argument, that this was a woman he intended to know for the rest of his life. He said he should have led with that. He recognized in retrospect that beginning with eggs rather than with words had been a choice of a certain kind, and he understood if she found it an unusual approach to expressing a serious intention. He was expressing the intention now, directly, in words, for the record. He looked at her and waited. Clara stood in the snow of the front yard with the leather satchel in her hand and 3 children somewhere at her back, and the whole of the life she had built on her own terms surrounding her. And she thought about everything she had not been able to think about until this moment. She thought about the note she had posted on the gate that had disappeared and left the eggs behind anyway. She thought about the first night she had not locked the gate and how Clement had found it unlatched and understood what it meant without being told. She thought about the evenings at the kitchen table that had started as negotiations and had become without her deciding they should the best hours of the day. She thought about standing in the kitchen doorway in the dark before dawn and finally seeing clearly, and without any more room for argument, what had been true since September. She thought about a man who had said nothing for 3 months and built a house instead because he was better at building than at saying, which was not a flaw and not a strategy, but simply the truest thing about him, the thing that was most irreducibly and unperformatively what he was. She set the satchel down in the snow. "You built us a farm," she said. His voice was quiet. "I built you a farm." She looked at him across the short distance of the gate, this plain-faced, unhurried man who had shown up at her step in the dark for 3 months with absolute conviction that it was his business to do so, who had been right and who had not, required her acknowledgement of that rightness in order to continue being right about it. "Yes," she said. She said it again because it was a word that deserved the repetition. "Yes, you stubborn, silent man. Yes." Willa made a sound from somewhere behind Clara that was distinctly and wholeheartedly celebratory. Dory, who had appeared at the door at some point and was taking in the scene with the frank assessment she brought to all situations, lifted both arms toward Silas in her customary manner, which in this context appeared to constitute a formal endorsement. Clement walked out from the doorway. He crossed the yard without hurry and stopped in front of Silas Holt and stood at his full height, which was the height of a boy who intended one day to be considerable and was already practicing. He had been watching Silas Holt since October with the careful, unforgiving attention of someone who has been hurt by a man before and does not intend to be hurried into trusting another one. He had watched the bridle and the lean-to door and the pine pitch on the window and every morning of coffee and silence and the particular gravity with which Silas received whatever Clement offered across the table. He had watched all of it and reached his conclusion in his own time, which was the only time that mattered to a boy like Clement. He put out his hand. Silas took it. Not as you take the hand of a child, not with the gentle accommodation of size, but as you take the hand of someone whose handshake means what it means and should be received that way. He shook it once, firm and equal, the way men in Colorado territory sealed the things that mattered most and said the least about. He looked at Clement with the full attention of a man who understood precisely what the gesture had cost and intended to honor it at that value and no other. Neither of them said anything. The silence between them was not empty. It was the specific silence of an agreement made between people who have decided that words would only diminish what they are agreeing to. They married in the first week of January at the church on Front Street in Garnet Falls in a ceremony that Reverend Pruitt conducted with the straightforward brevity appropriate to 2 people who were not there for ceremony, but had agreed to be present for the purpose of making official what had already been true for some time. The neighbors came. Ruford Cray came and stood at the back of the church in his good coat, the coat reserved for occasions that merited it, and he nodded at Silas across the room with the nod of a man who has watched something take shape over a long autumn and found the finished product satisfactory. Miss Alderton sat in the 3rd pew and cried, which she would have denied vigorously if pressed. Dr. Fenwick shook Clara's hand with both of his and said nothing, which was his way of saying quite a lot. Mrs. Adelaide Harlan came too, which Clara had not expected. She stood near the back and held her hands folded and watched the proceedings with an expression that had traveled some distance from where it usually lived. Something in it that was neither full approval nor quite apology, but was possibly the quiet country between the two. Clara caught her eye once across the church and nodded. Mrs. Harlan nodded back. Some things do not require words to constitute a resolution. Then they all rode out to the place on the creek. It was a gray January afternoon, the kind that holds its light low and even no shadows. Everything visible with a flat, quiet clarity that revealed rather than dramatized. The wagon wheels tracked through the snow on the east road, and the mountains were close on the left side and the creek audible beneath the ice on the right, and then the road turned and the building site opened before them. Clara looked at it. She had built a picture from Silas's description, 4 rooms south-facing window hen house garden plot. Well, she had thought she had the shape of it. She had not had it. The house stood in the flat ground by the creek, with the mountains ranged behind it, and it was built with the quality that distinguishes things made by a person who understood what they were making from things made by someone simply executing a plan. Every proportion was considered. The roofline had the pitch that shed snow without fighting it. The windows were set at a height that gathered the low winter light without surrendering the warmth behind them. The door faced east, so the morning came in first. It smelled of pine and work done honestly. The children went in ahead. She heard Willa's sound from the north hallway, something between surprise and recognition, as if the room was both new and somehow already expected. She heard Clement's careful steps in the back bedroom, measuring the space with his feet, converting it into something he could hold in his understanding. Dory said nothing at all, which meant she had found something of complete interest and was too occupied with it to comment. Clara walked into the kitchen. The south window was there wide with deep sills and the winter light coming through it in a long pale rectangle across the pine floor. The stove alcove was sized correctly, not crowded against the window, set back with room to move the way a person who had spent real time in kitchens would sight it. The floor was fitted tight, the planks tongue and groove, the kind of floor that did not give underweight and did not announce itself with every step. She walked the room and put her hand flat against the wall. It was solid in the way that things built with patience and full attention are solid, not just structurally, but in the sense of having arrived at a permanence that does not ask to be remarked on. Silas stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her. She moved through the house without speaking because there are things you need to be inside before you can speak about them. The bedroom where the morning light would come in early. The 2 north rooms where the mountains would be visible from the windows. The particular quality of the air in a house built from new pine, clean and specific, the smell of honest material. In the back corner of the main room she found the crib. Fitted pine, the joints clean and even the edges rounded with the deliberate care of something made for a very small person. She ran her hand along the rail and was quiet for a moment, thinking about a man building this alone in the evenings by lantern light, not knowing with certainty that it would ever be used, not waiting for permission, building it because it was the right thing to build, and the alternative was not building it. She stood beside the crib and let the understanding of the full autumn settle into its proper place, all of it from the eggs on the step in September to this room in January. One continuous statement made in materials rather than language, patient and consistent and entirely without demand. Then she went back to the kitchen. Silas was still in the doorway, watching her with the steady attention of a man who has done what he came to do and is in the position of waiting to see what it means. She looked at him. "I had the documents," she said. "Before you came Christmas morning. 3 weeks of preparation, Judge Harwick's confirmation and the full binder and the newspaper. I would have stood at that gate and said every word of it whether you had come or not." He looked at her without expression. "I know," he said. "I know you would have." She held his gaze. "I need you to know that, about me." "I do know it," he said. "I knew it in September." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked out the south window at the flat ground by the creek and the mountains beyond, and the winter light lying even across the snow. "The door faces east," she said. "Morning light comes in first that way." She nodded slowly. She had already known this standing in the doorway a minute ago. She had simply needed to say it. Outside, the January light lay flat, and even across the snow and the mountains were the color of things that have been present long enough to stop performing their presence and simply be it. The creek made its sound under the ice. In the other rooms, 3 children were claiming their spaces: Clement in the north room nearest the mountains, Willa in the smaller room beside him, Dory in the corner of the main room where the crib was running her hands along the rail the same way Clara had with the frank curiosity she brought to everything new. That evening, after the children were in their rooms, Clement in the north room, Willa beside him, Dory in the crib that had been made for her by a man who had not yet had permission to make it. Clara sat at the kitchen table with the lamp low and the stove working properly in its alcove, and Silas sat across from her. And neither of them said very much, because they were 2 people who had both learned that silence is not emptiness and did not need to prove otherwise. She thought about the note on the gate that had disappeared and left the eggs behind. She thought about the lean-to door and the pine pitch in the window, and the long night of the croup and a man walking the kitchen floor until the crisis passed, and then not putting the baby down. She thought about all of it assembled together and understood that it had always been the same statement repeated in different materials made by a man who had one thing to say, and found finally the words for it, only after he had already built the saying of it in wood and water and honest labor. In the morning, she rose before first light and started the stove in the new kitchen, which took a different kind of coaxing than the old one and would require its own learning, and put water on, and stood at the south window and watched the darkness begin its slow negotiation with the dawn. On the kitchen table, laid out on a square of clean white cloth, with the same care she remembered from a different step in a different house in the first week of October, were 4 brown eggs. Brown and smooth, still carrying the warmth of the hens in the hen house 15 yards from the kitchen door. The hens on the land whose deed now carried her name alongside his, in a house where the deed was the same on ground that was hers. In every sense the word had to offer. She stood and looked at them for a long time. She had learned something in the months that ran from September of 1879 to January of 1880 about the difference between a debt and a gift. She had spent most of her life refusing the second because she could not determine whether it was actually the first in different clothing. It had taken 3 months of eggs and a winter of watching and 1 long night in a kitchen and a Christmas morning at a gate to understand that some things are simply what they appear to be, given without hook, without ledger, without any expectation of return, by people for whom giving is not a strategy but a nature. She had learned slowly and with considerable resistance to hold that kind of thing. She had learned that the arithmetic she lived by was a good tool, one of the best she had, but that it was a tool, and tools have the limits of their purpose, and some sums are not given to us to solve, but only to accept. She picked up one of the eggs. It was warm in her palm, solid and entirely real, the realest thing she had held in a long time. Outside, the light was coming up over the mountains in the way that genuine things arrive steadily from the east without announcement, brightening by degrees until the snow on the flat ground by the creek was no longer gray but white, and the mountains were no longer dark shapes but themselves, and the new day was fully present and asking nothing of anyone except to be met. Clara Maughan had never had trouble meeting a day. She set the egg down gently on the cloth beside the others and turned to start the coffee, because there were 3 children who would wake soon, and a kitchen that was learning her, and a man who had built her a house before he knew how to say why, and the morning was here, and it was hers, and she was ready.